You're here because you want to get past the surface level, really understand how things tick, especially in the cybersecurity world.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into antivirus and EDR bypass techniques. Endpoint detection and response, that is.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area. We'll look at how these security tools actually work and then, the clever ways attackers try to get around them.
We'll even touch on this newer tool called Defendnot. Apparently, it takes a pretty unique approach to dealing with Windows Defender.
Exactly. It's like a behind-the-scenes look at that constant battle. Protection versus infiltration. We'll break down the security software's guts and then, the evasion tactics.
Okay, awesome. And before we jump right in, just a quick word about our sponsor. This deep dive is brought to you by Stonefly. They're leaders in enterprise storage, backup, disaster recovery, AI storage, and cloud solutions.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're looking for secure storage, maybe something ransomware-proof, Stonefly sells air-gapped and immutable storage solutions. You can contact them at sales@stonefly.com to set up a demo.
Good stuff.
All right, so let's get down to brass tacks. How do these AV and EDR tools actually, do their job? How do they keep us safe?
Well, it's really layers of defense, right?
Right.
The foundation is usually signature databases. Think of it like a huge library of criminal fingerprints.
Okay.
Every known bit of malware gets a unique ID, usually from a hash function like SHA-256. It creates this unique digital fingerprint.
Right.
The AV keeps this massive list. File shows up, AV calculates this fingerprint, checks the list, match, boom, alert.
So it's purely reactive then. It only knows what it's already seen.
Exactly. That's the big limitation. It's like recognizing someone only from their old wanted poster, a new threat, or even just a tiny change to an old one.
It misses it.
Totally. Change one tiny thing in the code, rename a variable, anything the fingerprint changes completely, signature detection fails.
Okay, so that's not enough on its own. What's next?
That's where static analysis comes in. This means looking at the program's code without actually running it.
Like looking for suspicious words or something?
Yeah, exactly. Searching for specific strings that are known to be part of malware, like finding the text mimikatz inside a file. That's a huge red flag.
All right, I've heard of tools that do that. And there's something called IRA rules, too. More advanced searching.
Yep. IRA rules are like super-powered custom search patterns. Security pros write these rules to look for specific text or binary patterns.
So not just one word, but maybe a combination of things or a specific structure.
Precisely. You could have a rule looking for, say, a unique comment string that a particular malware author always uses, even if the rest of the code changes. It's more flexible than just looking for mimikatz. But, someone still has to write and update those rules.
Okay, so signatures and static checks look at the file itself. But what if something looks okay, but acts suspiciously once it runs?
Now you're getting into heuristic and behavioral detection. Heuristics tries to guess intent by looking at the code structure, maybe spotting potentially shady instructions.
And behavioral.
Behavioral detection goes further. It runs the program in a safe space, a sandbox, and watches what it actually does. It looks for suspicious patterns of actions during execution.
Like what kinds of actions? What would trigger that?
Well, a classic one is seeing certain Windows API calls happening in a specific order. For instance, if a program calls open process, then virtual AllaX, then write process memory, and then create a remote threadx.
Whoa, that sounds technical.
It is, but that specific sequence is almost always used for something called process injection.
Mm-hmm.
That's where malware injects its code into a normal, legitimate process to hide. Seeing that pattern is a very strong signal.
Gotcha. So it's watching the actions, not just the static code. Now, you also mentioned the import address table, the IAT. What role does that play?
Right, the IAT. Think of it as a program's list of required tools and libraries. It's a table inside the executable file that lists all the external libraries, DLLs it needs, and the specific functions it imports from them.
So like a recipe listing its ingredients.
Kind of, yeah. When a program needs, say, a function to open a file, it lists that dependency in the IAT. AVs often scan this table.
And why scan that list?
Because, just like with behavioral analysis, certain combinations of imported functions can look really suspicious. Seeing those process injection functions we just talked about listed in the IAT, that's a potential red flag even before the program runs.
Even if it doesn't actually use them right away.
Exactly. It shows intent, maybe. Even, harmless programs like Notepad have an IAT listing all the standard Windows stuff it needs.
Okay, that makes sense. So the IAT is the list of planned tools. What about AMSI? That was another acronym.
AMSI. The anti-malware scan interface. This is actually built into Windows now. It lets applications themselves hook into the installed antivirus.
How does that work?
Developers can use the AMSI.dll library. There's a key function called AMSI scan string. An application can basically take a chunk of data, like a script command, and send it to the AV via AMSI, saying, hey, can you scan this? Does this look bad?
So the application itself asks the AV for a checkup. That's pretty smart.
It is. Not everything needs it. Like Notepad probably doesn't use AMSI for just text. But something powerful, like PowerShell, definitely uses AMSI.
Ah, so Defender can inspect PowerShell commands before they run.
Precisely. It lets the AV look at scripts or commands right as they're about to be executed. It's a really important layer, especially for fileless malware or scripting attacks.
Okay, clever. Now what about ETW, event tracing for Windows? Sounds like logging.
It is, yeah. ETW is a super powerful low-level logging system built deep into Windows. It lets different parts of the OS and applications record detailed event data, originally for debugging, but security tools realized it's a goldmine.
A system-wide black box, almost. Who uses this data?
Well, there are three parts. Providers generate the events, parts of the OS, drivers, apps. Consumers subscribe to these events, that's where your AV or EDR comes in, and controllers manage the whole process, like starting and stopping the logging.
So if malware tries something sneaky, ETW might log it, and the EDR sees the log.
That's the idea. There's even a specific ETW provider called Event Tracing for Windows Threat Intelligence. It's designed to log potentially malicious stuff.
That example.
Yeah, there's a kernel function, read-write virtual memory. When that gets called, it can trigger another function, @read-write vim, which checks if that threat intelligence provider is active. If it is, an event gets logged whenever something tries to read or write memory in another process using functions like nread virtual memory. The EDR sees that event.
Okay, wow. That's getting really deep into the system's monitoring. So the last piece of the defense puzzle was API hooking. Sounded really proactive.
It definitely is. API hooking is a favorite technique for EDRs. But first, quick detour, syscalls. When a regular Windows function, like openProcess in kernel32.dll, needs the operating system kernel to actually do something, it uses a system call, a syscall. It's the special way user programs talk to the protected kernel.
And where do these happen?
Most of the functions that initiate the syscall live in a really important file called ntll.dll. Their names usually start with NT, like Ento Open Process.
So kernel32 calls ntdl, which calls the kernel.
Basically, yes. OpenProcess calls into OpenProcess in ntdll, and that function does the magic syscall jump into the kernel. Now, here's what EDRs do. They often inject their own DLL into every new process that starts up.
Okay.
Then they find the memory addresses of important NT functions in NTL that they want to watch, like NT protect virtual memory, which changes memory permissions.
I think I see where this is going. They intercept it.
Exactly. The EDR overwrites the first few bytes of that NT-protect virtual memory function right there in memory. It replaces those bytes with a jump instruction.
A jump to where?
A jump to the EDR's own code inside its injected DLL. So before the real NT-protect virtual memory even gets a chance to run, the EDR gets control. It looks at the parameters, decides if it's suspicious, and then it can either let the original function run or just block it completely.
Wow. So even if malware avoids the IAT checks, the EDR can still catch it right at the syscall level. That's pretty intense.
It's a very powerful way to monitor system activity, yeah.
Okay, so I've got signatures, static analysis, heuristics, behavior checks, IAT inspection, AMSI, ETW, and API hooking. That sounds like a fortress. But obviously people do get around these things, so let's flip it. How do attackers bypass all this?
Right, well, let's start simple. Bypassing signatures. We already touched on it. Change one single bit in the malware file, and the hash changes completely.
So it's trivial, basically.
For basic signature detection, yeah, pretty much trivial. Modify the code slightly, recompile, and bam, new hash. Invisible to that layer.
Okay, so that's easily beaten. What about static analysis looking for those suspicious strings or patterns?
Obfuscation is key here, making the code deliberately hard to read and analyze. You change meaningful function names to gibberish.
Like using a tool.
Yeah. For languages like Go, there are tools like Garble that automatically scramble function names, package paths, even string literals, making static analysis much harder.
And what about the actual malicious payload, like shellcode?
You encrypt it. Use something strong like AES. The main loader program looks innocent. Maybe it just contains this encrypted blob. Then, right before execution, it decrypts the shellcode in memory and runs it. Static scan of the loader. Sees nothing obviously malicious.
Hide the bad stuff until the last second. Makes sense. How about dodging the behavioral analysis? The sandbox checks.
Anti-sandbox techniques. Malware tries to figure out if it's running in a real environment or an analysis sandbox.
How?
Lots of ways. It might check if the machine is joined to an Active Directory domain sandboxes usually aren't. It might look for signs of virtualization, low RAM, few CPU cores, small disk size, or specific virtual machine driver files like vboxguest.sys or vboxmouse.sys for VirtualBox.
And if it thinks it's in a
It
sandbox,
just doesn't do the bad stuff. It might exit quietly or just run benign code to look harmless.
couldn't those checks themselves look suspicious to the sandbox?
Oh, absolutely. That's the tricky part. Anti-sandbox checks can be a giveaway. So sophisticated malware might try to be subtle, or maybe even mix in lots of normal-looking, benign activity to create noise and confuse the analysis engine. It's a balancing act.
Okay. What about messing with that import address table, the IAT?
Yeah, you can try to hide your intentions there too. Some languages, like Go Again, make it easy to load DLLs and find function addresses at runtime using things like getProAddress.
They don't appear in the static list up front.
Exactly. Your Go program might use virtual AllegX heavily, but because it loaded it dynamically, it might not show up in the main IAT list that static tools examine. Although the call to get ProAddress itself will likely be in the IAT for Go program, so that could still be a hit.
So hiding the tool list, got it. Now, AMSI and ETW bypasses, you mentioned patching.
Right, patching in memory. For AMSI, a common trick is to find the address of, say, AMSIS and string within the target process, like PowerShell.
Find where it lives in memory.
Then use another function, like write process memory, to overwrite the very first byte of AMSIS scan string with the byte C3.
You see that?
That's the machine code for the read instruction returns. So you effectively change the function to just immediately return without doing anything. It completely disables AMSI scanning within that process.
You just neuter the function right there in memory. Wow. And ETW is similar.
Very similar principle. Find the address of a key ETW function, like 8to-eventWrite, which is the main one for sending logs. Patch its first byte with C3, the ret. Now it can't send logs anymore. The EDR or AV relying on those ETW events is suddenly blind.
So you just shut off the logging at the source?
Pretty much. Though sometimes patching an even lower level function like NT-trace event might be more effective, and that threat intelligence provider, ETWTI, often needs its own special bypass tricks. It's not always that simple.
Okay, patching sounds direct. What about bypassing that API hooking we talked about, where the EDR intercepts the NT calls? You mentioned indirect syscalls.
Right, this gets pretty advanced. The goal is to make the system call without going through the EDR's hook on the normal NT function in NT-tall.
Oh.
Well, the most direct way is called, unsurprisingly, direct syscalls. You basically write the raw assembly code for the syscall yourself, completely ignoring NT-tall.
Just do the kernel call directly from your own code.
Exactly. But the big problem is the syscall service numbers, the SSNs. These numbers identify which syscall you want, and they change between Windows versions, even minor updates sometimes. Hard coding them is unreliable.
So your malware might break on a different Windows version.
Precisely, which led to indirect syscalls. Instead of writing the whole syscall yourself, you find the address of the actual syscall instruction inside the legitimate nttl.dll, and you just jump directly to it.
So you're still using NTLL's code, but you're skipping the beginning part where the EDR put its hook.
Exactly. You jump right to the syscall instruction itself, and it gets even sneakier. You don't even have to jump to the syscall instruction for the function you want.
How does that work?
You can find the address of the syscall instruction for a different nearby end function, like, say, intallocate virtual memory. Then, before you jump, you manually put the correct SSN for the function you actually want, like end-to-open-process, into the processor's X register. Then you jump to the intallocate virtual memory syscall spot. The kernel looks at X, sees the SSN for end-to-open-process, and does that one instead.
Okay, that's bending my brain a little.
Yeah.
You jump to one place but tell the kernel to do something else.
Yeah.
Very sneaky. And find those SSNs dynamically. Hell's Gate.
Yeah, Hell's Gate is a technique for figuring out those pesky SSNs at runtime so you don't have to hardcode them. It knows SSNs are usually sequential within NTDL.
How does it work, roughly?
Okay, roughly. It maps NTDL, finds the export address table, EAT, to get all the NT function addresses. It hashes the function names to identify them. Then, for each function address, it scans the memory nearby, looking for a specific byte pattern, movar10 RCX, followed by movakix SSN. That pattern is almost always right before the syscall instruction. By finding that pattern, it can read the SSN value right out of the Movake's SSN instruction. It does this dynamically for all the functions it needs.
Even if the start of the function was hooked.
Yeah, because it's looking for the pattern near the syscall instruction, not necessarily right at the very beginning where the hook might be. It's incredibly clever.
Oh, okay. The lengths people go to, it's really something. Now, let's talk about this Defendnot tool. You said it had a novel way of disabling Defender.
Yeah, Defendnot. It's from a developer called EASE-S3NN, kind of a successor to an older tool, No Defender. Its trick is interacting with the Windows Security Center, the WSC.
How?
It registers itself with WSC as if it were a legitimate third-party antivirus, but it's completely fake.
And Windows sees this fake AV and turns off Defender.
Exactly. WSC is designed so that when you install, say, Norton or McAfee, it registers with the WSC, and Windows automatically disables Defender to avoid conflicts. Defendnot just exploits that mechanism.
But how does it register? I thought that was protected.
It is, and that's the novel part. Unlike the older tool, Defendnot apparently doesn't use any code ripped from real AV products. It talks directly to the WSC API, which is mostly undocumented.
That must have been hard to figure out.
Extremely. The developer wrote about the reverse engineering effort. They found WSC checks processes, trying to register it, looks for a specific flag in the file header, the force integrity flag, and it checks the digital signature.
So how does Defendnot pass those checks if it's fake?
Ah, the clever bit. It uses Task Manager, taskmgr.exe, as a host process.
Task Manager, why?
Because Task Manager is signed by Microsoft and has that required integrity flag. It's a trusted process that meets WSC's criteria. So Defendnot injects its code into Task Manager.
And registers from inside Task Manager.
Yep. From within the trusted Task Manager process, it uses COM interfaces like IWSC product list to talk to WSC and register its Phantom AV product. A security researcher, Will Dorman, called it installing a null AV product. Its only purpose is to trick WSC into disabling Defender.
That is.
Wow.
Using a trusted system tool against itself. Does it stick around? Does Defender stay off after a reboot?
It tries to. Defendnot adds itself to the Windows Task Scheduler to run automatically when the system starts. That way, it re-registers the fake AV and keeps Defender disabled.
Are there options? Can you control what it does?
Yeah, it has command line options, like disable to try and undo the changes, firewall to try and disable the firewall too, just for the antivirus part, and name lets you pick the fake AV's name that shows up in Security Center.
It sounds potent. And cleaner than the old one, No Defender, which got into legal trouble for using other AV code, right?
Exactly. This is a clean room implementation, which is significant. But the security community reaction is mixed.
How so?
Well, people acknowledge the technical skill involved. It's impressive reverse engineering. But there's huge concern that malware authors will just grab this technique to disable defenses on machines they infect.
Makes sense. Is it easy to use?
It does need administrator privileges to run, which is a barrier. And importantly, Microsoft Defender is now detecting and blocking Defendnot itself, often classifying it as something like win32sabsic.fl.ml, so it's not exactly stealthy anymore.
So the cat and mouse game continues. I saw a mention of someone on Reddit asking about mimicking an AV for WSC, maybe for legitimate testing.
Yeah, that's a valid point. Researchers might want to test how their own tools interact with WSC without actually disabling Defender entirely, so there could be legitimate research uses for understanding these interactions.
Right, and you mentioned that old task scheduler vulnerability, Sandbox Escaper. Not directly related, but it shows how system components can have unexpected weaknesses.
Exactly. It's just a reminder that complexity breeds vulnerabilities, even in core system services like Task Scheduler or WSC.
Absolutely. Well, this has been incredibly insightful. We've gone from basic signatures all the way to these really complex API hooking bypasses.
Yeah.
And this Defendnot tool exploiting the security center itself.
Yeah.
It's clear this whole field is constantly moving.
It really is. It's a perpetual state of flux. Defenders build a wall, attackers find a way through it, defenders build a higher wall. Understanding these evasion methods is just crucial if you want to build better defenses.
Couldn't agree more. And on that note, a big thank you again to our sponsor for supporting this deep dive. This was brought to you by Stonefly, leaders in enterprise storage, backup, DR, AI storage, and cloud solutions. If secure, ransomware-proof storage is on your mind, check out their air-gapped and immutable options. Contact sales at stonefly.com for a demo. And finally, something for you, our listener, to think about. Given this constant complex game between security tools and bypass techniques, what does that really mean for the future? How much can we truly rely on the built-in protections we often just assume are working perfectly? Definitely some food for thought.